Hello, blessings, peeps. It's Pastor Bill here. I had a very busy week at the church, and so we were very grateful that Paul Vandenbrink could step in for me and lead our evening service, and preach at our evening service, I should say. But we didn't want to abort our series on the Ten Commandments, and so I thought I would record a video in the church basement and then produce it for dissemination among small groups, so you would still have a video on one of the Ten Commandments to discuss in your small groups. And we're up to the seventh commandment, and so the theme of this topic is fidelity or faithfulness. I want to begin by reading a few verses from Paul's letter to the Ephesians, chapter 5. Paul in this context is talking about marriage, and I think it's instructive what he says here. He says in verse 31, "For this reason a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh." This is a profound mystery, but I'm talking about Christ and the church. The marriage between a man and a woman is a profound mystery. Now, mystery in the New Testament doesn't mean what mystery means today, namely a riddle or a puzzle to be resolved. Mystery has the sense of something that was once concealed and now is revealed, something that was once hidden and now is disclosed. What precisely is the mystery that marriage reveals? It's that God intended marriage right from the very outset to be a picture of the relationship between Christ and the church. That's the overarching story. And if you see a married couple today, they are enacting and participating in a story that far transcends their individual stories. They are telling, in some sense, the story of the relationship between Christ and the church. Where does that story begin? Well, I would argue that it begins at the very beginning of the Bible in Genesis 1:1, where we read about God creating the heavens and the earth. The Genesis account begins with a binary, heaven and earth. Heaven in the Bible denotes God's unadulterated space. And earth is, of course, created out of heaven. But what we discover is that God intends for earth to be reunited with heaven. That is, in fact, the ultimate purpose of history. And that is, of course, then how the Bible ends, with this full reunion of heaven and earth. Now, as you read on in the creation account in Genesis 1, you discover a series of binaries, light and darkness, land and sea, and so forth. And the crescendo of all of those binaries is the binary between male and female. God creates male and female to correspond to the binary or couplet of heaven and earth. And just as earth is created out of heaven in order to be reunited with heaven, so Eve is created out of Adam in order to be reunited with Adam. These are aspects of a binary that correspond together, that fit together, heaven and earth, male and female. So that is the overarching story of the world. And the relationship between Christ and the church is, of course, a key component in that story. It is what most accurately prefigures or previews the full reunion between heaven and earth, Christ representing heaven and the church representing earth. And this is why in the Old Testament, idolatry for Israel was regarded as adultery, because God had a covenant relationship with Israel, just as Christ does with the church, just as a groom does with his bride. And if there is infidelity, well, then that relationship is, of course, very much affected. And for Israel, that was represented by idolatry, by pursuing another lover. Now, in the Genesis account, we discover that marriage is to be characterized by permanence and exclusivity. A man shall leave his father and his mother and cleave to his wife. There you see the exclusivity, man and his wife, but you also see the permanence. He shall cleave to his wife. And of course, what God joins together, people should not break apart. So these are, of course, the very same characteristics that Jesus has in relation to the church: permanence and exclusivity. He, of course, tells us in the book of Hebrews, chapter 13, that he will never leave us or forsake us. Now, I want to tease out some concluding points for your consideration. Something very interesting has occurred with the surge of atheism in our day. God has been excised from our worldviews. We were created to be in love with God. Our hearts were created for a relationship with God, a relationship in which we are affirmed, a relationship in which we are dignified. Well, if you remove God from the picture, where are you going to find that dignity? Where are you going to find that affirmation? What we discover in our world is people turn to romance. They turn to romantic partners, and they look for that particular value and affirmation in a romantic partner that only God can provide. And so we see the idolization in some ways of romance itself. This relates to my second point. If you want to have a good marriage, or for that matter, even if you want to have a good friendship, you should not absolutize marriage, and you should not absolutize your spouse. If you regard marriage as the thing that is going to give you happiness, you're going to be disappointed. If you regard your spouse as the person who's finally going to make you happy, you're going to be disappointed. That's not how we were created, and no person can possibly bear the burden of being responsible to keep another person happy. Our sense of value, our affirmation, is to come from God. That's who we were ultimately created to be in relationship with. So we must relativize the importance of marriage, and we must relativize the importance of our spouse, and we must see, especially if we're married, that we are anchored in our relationship to the Lord Jesus Christ. I think this is how we can make sense of what the Apostle Paul says in 1 Corinthians 7, where in some ways it seems as if he has a dim view of marriage. And I want to read a few verses from 1 Corinthians 7, where Paul recommends the calling of singlehood. Verse 32, I would like you to be free from concern. An unmarried man is concerned about the Lord's affairs, how he can please the Lord, but a married man is concerned about the affairs of this world, how he can please his wife. And his interests are divided. An unmarried woman or virgin is concerned about the Lord's affairs. Her aim is to be devoted to the Lord in both body and spirit, but a married woman is concerned about the affairs of this world, how she can please her husband. I'm saying this for your own good and not to restrict you, that you may live in a right way in an undivided devotion to the Lord. If you are single, you are closer to the final state, to the new earth, than married people are, because there is no marriage in the final state. And that's because we will all be married to the Lord, for which we were created. And this is why Paul says, look, if you get married, please understand your interests are going to be divided between spouse and the Lord. If you remain single, you can begin to experience now, in admittedly a very small way, precisely that kind of fellowship and union that we will enjoy at when the new creation is revealed. And this is, of course, what we hear towards the end of the book of Revelation. I want to read just the opening verses of Revelation 21. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and there was no longer any sea. I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride, beautifully dressed for her husband. That's where world history ends. Not simply with a marriage between Christ and the church, but the full reunion of heaven and earth. Marriage is simply a picture of the relationship between Christ and the church. And when we finally enjoy the consummation of that relationship, the institution of marriage will pass away.